The water was just above freezing, swirling with jagged shards of ice, when Margaret Hayes heard a sound she would never forget, a desperate, choking gasp that didn't belong to any fisherman or hiker. She could barely see through the thick mountain mist, but she knew something was fighting for life out there. What she didn't know was that this moment would change her life, and that of a young bear, forever. Margaret's boots thudded on the worn planks of the dock as she moved closer to the edge, her breath clouding in the icy air. The sound came again, a weak, frantic gasp followed by splashes that echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Her eyes narrowed against the haze, and then she saw it. A small dark shape bobbing in the water, barely keeping afloat, its tiny head jerking up for air. For a heartbeat, her mind told her it was impossible. A bear cub out here, in the middle of this freezing lake? But instinct took over before doubt could root itself. Without thinking, she kicked off her heavy wool coat and dropped to her knees. The water was cruel and unwelcoming, the kind that seeped into bones and pulled heat away faster than any fire could return it. Margaret lowered herself onto her stomach and reached out with her cane, extending it toward the struggling creature. The cub's claws scraped desperately against the wood as it tried to climb, slipping again and again, each failure pulling it closer to exhaustion. She could see its small chest heaving, its mouth opening and closing without sound now, its strength fading. Margaret had lived long enough to know hesitation could kill, and not just for people. She set the cane aside and leaned dangerously far over the edge, her fingertips brushing wet fur. The cub let out a weak, pitiful whimper that went straight to her heart. Gripping the scruff of its neck, she hauled upward with all the force her wiry frame could muster. The weight was surprising, water streamed from the cub's matted coat, soaking her sleeves, but she didn't care. Inch by inch, she lifted until its small body collapsed onto the dock beside her, shivering violently. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The cub's dark eyes were wide with fear and confusion, yet there was something else there, a flicker of recognition that this human wasn't a threat. Margaret's heart pounded, but she spoke softly, the way she might to a frightened child. "It's all right now. You're safe." Her voice carried warmth, and though the cub didn't understand the words, it seemed to understand the tone. She glanced toward the forest edge. No mother bear in sight. That worried her. Cubs rarely strayed far unless something had happened. The thought tightened her chest, but right now survival mattered most. She needed to get this little one warm. Pulling her coat back on, she bundled the cub against her body, ignoring its weak squirms. Its fur was cold, almost icy to the touch, and she could feel its tremors through the fabric. The cabin wasn't far, but the path was uneven and lined with roots that snagged at her boots. Margaret walked carefully, cradling the cub as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Snow crunched underfoot, and every so often, she could hear the cub make a faint sound, halfway between a whine and a sigh. Her arms ached by the time the cabin came into view, a humble structure with smoke curling from its chimney. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them both like a blanket. She set the cub near the hearth, adding more wood to the fire until the flames roared. The cub curled up instinctively, nose tucked under its paw, steam rising from its wet fur. Margaret fetched a thick wool blanket and draped it over him, careful not to cover his face. It wasn't the first wild animal she'd helped. Living in the mountains for decades had meant injured deer, orphaned fox kits, even a snowy owl once. But this felt different. There was a fragility to him, a sense that if she'd arrived even a minute later, he would have been gone. As the day wore on, the cub began to stir more. He sniffed the air, his tiny black nose twitching toward the scent of the fire. Margaret prepared a shallow bowl of warm milk, aware that it wasn't perfect for a bear but hoping it might give him some energy until he could find real food. He hesitated at first, eyes darting from her to the bowl, but hunger eventually won. Watching him lap it up, Margaret felt a strange swell of protectiveness. That night, she made a bed for him beside the hearth. The cub slept deeply, occasionally twitching in dreams, while Margaret sat in her rocking chair, listening to the wind howl outside. She knew she couldn't keep him. Wild animals belonged in the wild. But she also knew she wouldn't just leave him to fend for himself until he was stronger. Morning brought clear skies and a pale sun that glittered off the snow. The cub was more alert now, following her movements with his eyes. When she opened the door to fetch wood, he waddled after her, his small paws leaving prints beside hers. Margaret chuckled softly. "Well, aren't you a little shadow?" she murmured. For 3 days, the cub stayed close. Margaret fed him bits of fish and berries, encouraged him to explore the yard, and even watched him attempt to climb the smallest pine by the cabin. But she kept her distance enough to remind him he was still a wild creature, not a pet. On the 4th day, she decided it was time. She carried him to the edge of the forest, knelt, and looked into those deep, dark eyes one last time. "You have to go now," she whispered. "Find your kind." The cub hesitated, glancing between her and the shadows of the trees. Then, with a small huff, he turned and padded into the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth. Margaret stood there for a long while, her breath visible in the cold air, before finally turning back toward the cabin. She didn't expect to see him again. Nature was unpredictable, and bears grew quickly. By spring, he would be unrecognizable. But life, as she was about to learn, had other plans. It was exactly 1 year later, on a similar crisp morning, when Margaret heard movement outside her porch. At first, she thought it might be deer. But then came a sound, a low, familiar huff. Stepping outside, she froze. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a young black bear, taller, stronger, but with eyes she recognized instantly. He took a few steps forward, stopping just short of the porch, as if unsure. Margaret's heart pounded, but she smiled. "You remember," she said softly. The bear huffed again, almost like an answer. And just like that, a ritual began, one that would repeat year after year. The visits were never long. The bear, no longer the fragile cub she'd pulled from the freezing water, would appear quietly at the edge of her property, watch her for a while, and then vanish back into the forest without a sound. At first, Margaret thought it was coincidence. Perhaps he was just passing through, drawn by the smell of her wood smoke or the berry bushes near the porch. But the timing was too precise. Always in early winter, always when the snow had settled deep enough to muffle footsteps. On the 3rd year, he came closer. Margaret had been stacking wood near the shed when she felt it, that strange sense of being watched. She turned, and there he was, standing only 20 feet away, his black fur dusted with snowflakes. His size was startling now, his shoulders were broad, his muzzle longer, his presence commanding. And yet, those eyes, they hadn't changed. They still held that flicker of recognition, as if he remembered not just her face, but the moment she had pulled him from death's edge. She didn't speak this time. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that she saw him, that she knew he was still out there. The bear huffed, the same low, almost conversational sound he'd made the day he first returned, and then ambled back into the trees. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Margaret found herself thinking of him more than usual. She wondered where he went, what dangers he faced. Out here, the wilderness was beautiful, but it was also merciless. The mountain lions, the freezing winters, the scarce food. It was a wonder any bear survived to adulthood. By the 5th year, the visits changed. He no longer appeared only once. Sometimes, she'd catch sight of him in the summer, lumbering past the berry bushes. Other times, she'd hear his heavy footfalls at night, pacing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Once, she woke to find him sitting near the edge of her dock, staring at the water, the same lake that had nearly claimed him. But it was the 7th winter that burned itself into her memory. A storm had rolled in from the north, the kind that swallowed the mountains whole. Snow piled higher than her porch railing, and the wind howled like a living thing. Margaret was huddled by the fire when she heard it, a deep, urgent thump against her door. Her heart jumped. Wolves sometimes came close during storms, desperate for shelter, but this sound was heavier, slower. She grabbed her lantern and cracked the door open against the wind. He was there. The bear stood massive against the blizzard, his fur matted with snow, his breaths coming fast. But it wasn't his presence that made Margaret's blood run cold, it was what dangled from his jaws. A limp, half-frozen fox kit, its tiny body barely moving. Without a second thought, she stepped aside. The bear entered as far as the threshold, dropped the kit gently onto the floor, and then backed away. He didn't linger. He turned, disappearing into the whiteout storm, leaving only deep paw prints in the snow. Margaret knelt quickly, scooping the trembling kit into her arms. It was barely alive, just as he had been all those years ago. She moved fast, setting it near the fire, rubbing warmth back into its small limbs. As she worked, her mind kept circling back to one thought: he had brought it here. He could have left it to die in the snow, but he didn't. He had remembered. The fox kit survived, eventually returning to the wild in the spring. And though the bear never came to the door again, his visits continued. Sometimes near, sometimes far, but always there, like a silent guardian in the trees. Margaret was old now, her hair white as the snow she'd trudged through all her life. Each winter, she wondered if this would be the last time she saw him. Yet every time, without fail, he came. Not for food. Not for shelter. Just to be seen. Then came the 12th year. The air that morning was heavy with frost, and Margaret sat on her porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the pale sun struggle through the clouds. Her breath came slower these days, her hands less steady. But when she saw the shadow moving at the edge of the forest, her heart still quickened like it had the very first time. He was older now, too. His fur was streaked with silver, his movements slower, but the strength in him was still there. He approached the porch, closing the distance until he stood only a few steps away. Margaret looked into those eyes, older, wiser, but still holding that same unspoken thread between them. For a long while, they simply looked at each other. No sound, no movement. Just two survivors, bound by a moment in time that had never faded. Finally, Margaret smiled. "We've both made it longer than anyone thought, haven't we?" she said softly. The bear lowered his head, almost like a nod, then turned back toward the forest. He paused only once, glancing over his shoulder before vanishing into the trees. Margaret never saw him again. But in her heart, she knew he was still out there, not as the frightened cub she had once pulled from the water, but as the wild, unbroken creature he was meant to be. And she also knew that somewhere, deep in the quiet places of the mountains, a bear remembered her face. The spring after that winter was unusually quiet. Margaret kept watch from her porch, scanning the tree-line every morning with a cup of tea in hand. Usually, by April, he would have appeared at least once, a dark shape moving between the green undergrowth, a fleeting presence reminding her he was still there. But the days passed without a sign. By mid-May, a knot of worry had taken root in her chest. She told herself he could be ranging farther than usual, searching for food, or perhaps keeping to the higher ridges where the snow melted last. Still, she knew the truth of the wild. Sometimes, absence meant the worst had happened. One evening, as she was locking up for the night, a faint, distant sound drifted through the stillness, a low, drawn-out bellow. It was the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. It wasn't the sharp cry of a wounded animal, nor the warning roar of a territorial bear. This was different. Slower. Weaker. She grabbed her lantern. The sound came again, somewhere beyond the lake. Margaret moved quickly, her boots sinking into the soft earth along the shore. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and thawing soil. She followed the calls, heart pounding, until she reached the far side of the lake where the forest thickened. And there he was. The sight stopped her in her tracks. The bear was lying on his side in a small clearing, his chest heaving. His fur was ragged, mud caked along his flanks, and one of his back legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. Around him, the ground was torn up with deep claw marks, as if he had fought and fought hard. Margaret's breath caught. She knew the risk of getting too close. An injured bear was unpredictable, dangerous even to those he recognized. But as she stepped forward, his eyes found hers, and the fight seemed to drain from his body. She knelt a few feet away, speaking softly. "It's all right. You're all right." For a long time, they just stayed like that, an old woman and a wounded bear, the silence between them thick with memory. Slowly, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle of dried fish she had brought, just in case. She set it on the ground and backed away. He didn't move immediately, but eventually, with visible effort, he pulled himself toward it and ate. It took her 3 days of returning, each time with food and fresh water, before he could even rise to his feet. She didn't try to treat the wound, she wasn't foolish enough to think she could mend a bear's broken leg, but she stayed, keeping him company, speaking to him as if her voice alone could keep him tethered to life. By the 4th day, he was gone. Not dead, gone. The place where he had lain was empty, his paw prints leading into the deeper woods. Margaret followed them for a while but stopped when they climbed toward the higher ridges. That was his world, not hers. Weeks passed before she saw him again. It was late summer when he appeared on the ridge above her cabin, silhouetted against the setting sun. He stood for a long moment, head lifted, then turned and disappeared into the fading light. It was the last time she would see him in his prime. Years passed, and his visits became less frequent, his movements slower, his once black fur now streaked with gray. But he still came, and every time he did, it was the same, that long, silent acknowledgement between two lives forever linked by one cold, fateful day. And then came the winter that nearly ended everything. It was a night of relentless snow, the kind that erases all sense of direction. Margaret was dozing by the fire when a faint sound reached her through the wind, not the deep thump of a paw on her porch, but a sharp, ragged gasp. She grabbed her coat and lantern, stepping into the storm. At the edge of her porch lay the bear. He was thinner than she'd ever seen him, his body trembling violently. His breath came in short, labored bursts, steam rising from his muzzle only to vanish into the night. Margaret dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hand lightly against his fur. He was cold, far too cold. She did something then she had never done before. She opened the cabin door wide. The bear, as if understanding, dragged himself forward, collapsing onto the wooden floor. The warmth of the fire filled the space, the wind howling outside like a chorus of ghosts. Margaret sat beside him through the night, keeping the fire alive, whispering to him the way she had all those years ago. She didn't sleep. She knew this might be his last night. By dawn, the storm had passed. Weak sunlight spilled into the cabin, casting a golden glow on his fur. Slowly, with visible effort, he rose to his feet. Margaret stepped aside as he made his way to the door. He paused, turning his head toward her one last time, before stepping into the snow and disappearing into the forest. She never saw him again. But every winter, when the snow fell heavy and the wind swept down from the mountains, Margaret swore she could hear the soft, steady sound of paw prints circling the edge of her clearing, a quiet reminder that somewhere, in the deep wild, a bear still remembered her. It had been 40 years since that first rescue, but Margaret could still recall every detail as if it had happened the day before. The river that spring was swollen with meltwater, roaring louder than she'd ever heard. Sheets of ice broke loose and tumbled downstream like drifting glass. She'd gone out to check the fence line when she saw something caught against a cluster of fallen branches near the bend. At first, she thought it was a log, but then it moved. A small, sodden shape was clinging desperately to the tangle, its fur plastered flat against its tiny frame. Even from the bank, she could see the terror in its eyes. It was no more than a cub, alone, exhausted, and about to be pulled under. The current was vicious. One wrong step, and she'd be swept away. But there was no hesitation. She kicked off her boots, waded in, and let the freezing water slam into her legs. It stole her breath and numbed her muscles in seconds, but she pushed forward, grabbing at branches to steady herself. When she reached the cub, he was limp, barely holding on. She hooked her arm around him, prying his claws free from the branch. He didn't fight her. In fact, he seemed too tired to even notice she was there. With each step back toward the bank, the current fought to drag them both under, but Margaret moved slowly, carefully, never loosening her grip. By the time they reached dry ground, her arms and legs felt like stone. She set the cub down on the grass, kneeling beside him. His sides heaved with shallow breaths, and a low, pitiful sound escaped his throat. She knew better than to keep him close. A wild creature had to stay wild, but she also knew if she left him alone in that moment, he wouldn't survive. So she stayed. She built a small fire nearby, sitting close enough for its warmth to reach him without frightening him away. From her satchel, she pulled out an old wool blanket and laid it on the ground beside him. The cub sniffed at it, then curled into a tight ball. For hours, they remained like that, a shivering cub and a soaked, shivering woman, both holding on to the quiet safety of the firelight. At some point, he lifted his head and looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. It wasn't the look of an animal sizing up a stranger. It was something else. Something she couldn't quite name. By morning, he was gone. Margaret told herself she'd done all she could, that nature would take its course from here. But a week later, she found him again, this time near the tree line behind her cabin. He stood watching her, head tilted, as if deciding whether to approach. She didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. Eventually, he turned and disappeared into the woods. But after that, he kept coming back. At first, it was just glimpses, a shadow between trees, a rustle in the undergrowth. Then, as the months passed, he grew bolder. He'd appear at the edge of her clearing at dusk, watching as she chopped wood or carried water. Once, she left a small pile of berries near the porch. By morning, they were gone, and in their place, a single pawprint in the mud. He was growing fast, his fur thickening into a deep, glossy black, his shoulders widening. By the second year, he was a powerful young bear, but to Margaret, he was still the shivering cub she'd pulled from the river. Over the years, an unspoken pattern formed. He came when the seasons shifted, in the spring thaw, in the first heat of summer, in the golden chill of autumn. And every time, there was that same silent exchange of recognition. No one in the nearby town believed her when she mentioned him. "Bears don't remember people," they'd say. "You're just seeing different ones." But she knew better. This wasn't a random bear wandering by. This was him. The cub she'd saved. And though she never gave him a name, because naming him would feel like keeping him, she carried his presence like a secret gift. In the weeks that followed, John found himself scanning the edge of the forest every morning. The habit was impossible to break. A flicker of shadow, the snap of a twig, the flash of brown fur in the sunlight, each made his heart leap with hope. But no bear came. Word of Bruno's last visit began to spread in the nearby town. It started with a passing comment to the hardware store owner, "He brought his young one this year," and somehow, within days, everyone knew. The story took on a life of its own. Some locals spoke of Bruno as if he were a guardian spirit of the mountain, a wild protector who had chosen John as his human counterpart. Others swore the visits were a sign of something bigger, a reminder that the barrier between the wild and the civilized world wasn't as thick as people thought. And while John never sought attention, the tale of the bear who came back every spring became a kind of folk legend. Hunters claimed they'd seen the younger bear near the ridge, large now, with the same steady gaze as his father. Hikers whispered about a cabin porch where a man and a bear had once sat side by side without fear. One afternoon in early summer, a young couple from town knocked on John's door. They held a sketch, a beautiful pencil drawing of an old man in a rocking chair with a great bear beside him. "We heard the story," the woman said softly, "and we wanted you to have this." John took the drawing, his throat tightening. He hung it on the wall above the fireplace, where it caught the light each evening. Years slipped by. The cabin aged with him. The forest grew thicker, the winters harsher. Still, sometimes, on still nights when the moon hung low over the pines, John would hear a distant, familiar sound, a deep, rolling vocalization, carried faintly on the wind. He liked to think it was the younger bear, somewhere out there in the darkness, remembering. When John passed away quietly in his sleep one autumn, the people of the valley came together to honor him. They placed a simple wooden bench on his porch with a small brass plaque. "Here sat John Carter, friend to the wild." The cabin still stands, weathered and half swallowed by the forest. And sometimes, on misty mornings, hikers swear they've seen a large, dark shape moving just beyond the trees. Watching the porch. Waiting. Whether it's the son of Bruno, or his son's son, no one knows. But the legend endures, of a man who once saved a bear, and a bear who never forgot. Winter came early that year. Snow arrived before the last leaves had fallen, layering the forest in soft silence. Margaret's cabin stood like a lantern in the white expanse, smoke curling from its chimney. The world felt smaller in winter, but to her, it felt closer, more intimate, the way the snow muffled sound, the way every step left a trace that lingered. She woke one morning to a stillness so deep it felt almost sacred. Stepping outside, she saw the sun low on the horizon, staining the snow in pale gold. Her breath formed little clouds in the cold, and the only sound was the creak of ice on the river. Something told her to follow the old path. She wrapped herself in a heavy wool coat, slipped the returned blanket over her shoulders, and set out. The snow was knee-deep in places, but she moved slowly and surely, her boots crunching through the untouched drifts. When she reached the bend in the river, she stopped. He was there. The bear stood at the water's edge, his massive frame dusted with snow, his breath rising in steady puffs. For a moment, neither moved. The years seemed to gather around them like invisible witnesses, all the visits, all the silences, all the quiet exchanges that had bound them across decades. Margaret stepped forward, stopping a respectful distance away. She didn't speak. She never had to. This time, however, he did something he had never done before. Slowly, with a weight that spoke of age and the coming end of his strength, he lowered himself onto his belly in the snow. His head rested on his paws, and his eyes closed briefly, as if the effort of the journey had been great. Margaret's throat tightened. She had seen enough seasons in the forest to recognize the truth. He had come, perhaps, not just to visit, but to say goodbye. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into her boots, the river murmuring beside them. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the memory of springtime. Finally, the bear rose again. It was slow, deliberate. He looked at her one last time, holding her gaze in a way that felt like the quiet passing of a torch. Then, without sound, he turned and walked into the trees, his massive form fading into the white. Margaret stayed until he was gone. She didn't cry. Instead, she wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and began the walk back to the cabin, each step crunching like a heartbeat in the snow. She never saw him again. But every winter after, when the first snow fell and the river began to freeze, she would place the blanket on the porch railing, letting the wind carry its scent into the forest, just in case. Because even if he never returned, she knew the bond they shared didn't need visits to survive. It had already lived longer than either of them had any right to expect. The winters after his disappearance felt different. The forest still held its familiar rhythms, the first frost in October, the frozen river by December, the soft thud of snow falling from heavy branches, but there was an emptiness threaded through them. Margaret aged quietly in those years. Her hair, once silver, turned almost white, and her hands, still strong, began to tremble when she lifted the kettle from the stove. Neighbors from town sometimes stopped by, bringing firewood or homemade pies, but most of her days were spent in the company of the forest. And in a way, the bear had never truly left. She found his tracks in her dreams. She heard him in the groan of the pines during a storm. She saw him in the quiet patience of the deer that lingered near the porch at dusk. His presence was stitched into the fabric of her life, and though the visits had stopped, the connection endured. One spring, nearly 5 years after that last winter meeting, Margaret decided to walk to the bend in the river again. The snow had melted, and the air smelled of wet earth and green things pushing up from the soil. She moved slowly now, leaning on a carved walking stick, the blanket draped over her shoulders like a promise. When she reached the spot, the river was running fast with meltwater. The trees along the bank were taller than she remembered, their branches knit together in a green canopy. She closed her eyes and listened to the water rushing past, imagining the way he used to stand there, massive and sure, as if he belonged to both land and river at once. That was when she saw it, just beyond a cluster of birches, near the place where the bear had once rested in the snow. A smaller figure moved among the shadows. At first, she thought it was her eyes playing tricks. But then it stepped forward, revealing the shape of a young bear, its coat thick and dark, its head tilted in cautious curiosity. Margaret's breath caught. The bear was not him, the size and shape told her that much, but there was something in the way it stood, the way it didn't run, that felt familiar. Slowly, without thinking, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an apple she had brought as a snack. She placed it on the ground and stepped back. The young bear sniffed the air, then padded forward, taking the apple in its jaws. For a moment, it stood still, the same way his father, or perhaps his grandfather, had once done, watching her with quiet eyes. Then it turned and slipped into the trees. Margaret smiled, her heart warm in the cool spring air. The forest had a way of carrying on, of passing down not just life, but memory. And maybe, just maybe, the bear she had saved all those years ago had left something behind to keep the visits alive. That night, she sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, the blanket around her shoulders, listening to the distant calls of night creatures. Somewhere out there, she knew, the forest still remembered her, just as she remembered it. Summer came, and with it, long days of golden light spilling over the valley. Margaret's porch became her favorite place again, not because she expected to see the bear, but because it faced the forest, and the forest held every memory that mattered. On quiet evenings, she would rock slowly in her chair, the creak of the wood matching the rhythm of the crickets. Sometimes she'd speak softly into the dusk, as if telling the trees a story only they could hear. Then, one August afternoon, when the air was warm and heavy with the scent of wild flowers, a sound broke through the stillness, the crunch of heavy footsteps in the grass. She turned her head, heart thudding. From between two pine trunks, a large shape emerged. For a heartbeat, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks again. But then the shape moved forward into the sunlight. He was older now, his fur touched with silver, his movements slower, but it was him. The same eyes, deep and knowing, locked on hers. Margaret rose to her feet, leaning on the porch railing. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The years between them seemed to dissolve. He stepped closer, stopping just at the edge of the porch. The boards creaked beneath Margaret's feet as she bent down, reaching for the same old blanket draped over her chair. She held it out, the fabric worn thin in places but still carrying the faint scent of cedar and home. The bear sniffed it, then let out a low, rumbling breath, almost like a sigh, before backing away. His gaze lingered on her, and then he turned toward the trees. Margaret didn't call out. She didn't move to stop him. Some bonds didn't need words or touch to stay alive. As he disappeared into the forest, the evening light caught his silhouette one last time before the shadows claimed it. Margaret stood there, her hand still holding the blanket, knowing deep in her bones that he had come back not out of need, but out of choice. The visits might never be regular again, and one day they would stop entirely. But in this moment, she understood something the forest had been trying to tell her all along: love, once given, leaves a mark that nothing can erase. She sat back down in her rocking chair, the sun dipping low, the sound of the river faint in the distance. The world felt complete again, even if just for one summer night. The days after that visit felt different, as if the air itself carried a quiet magic. Margaret found herself moving slower through her routines, savoring the smallest details. The cool touch of morning dew on her porch railing, the laughter of the neighbors' children chasing each other in the distance, the gentle murmur of the river at night. Sometimes, she'd catch herself glancing toward the tree line, half hoping, half knowing she wouldn't see him again for a long while. Yet, the knowledge that he was still out there, somewhere in those wild hills, brought her a peace she hadn't felt in years. Word had spread in the small mountain town. A few neighbors who had always been skeptical about her bear stories began to ask careful questions. Margaret answered sparingly, protecting the truth like a precious stone, too delicate to handle roughly, too valuable to give away freely. One afternoon, the mailman, a younger man new to the route, lingered longer than usual at her gate. He said he'd heard the locals talk about her forest friend and wondered if it was true. Margaret only smiled and said, "Some things are only real if you believe in them." The man chuckled politely, but something in her tone left him quiet as he walked away. In her heart, Margaret knew the story wasn't just hers. The bear carried it too, in every step through the underbrush, every drink from the cold mountain stream. Wherever he roamed, a part of that bond traveled with him. Autumn crept in slowly. The leaves turned a brilliant blaze of orange and gold, and Margaret often stood outside, watching them drift to the ground in slow spirals. She pictured him preparing for the winter, finding a den, settling in against the frost. On the first truly cold morning, she brewed herself a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table, steam curling in the pale light. She thought of the moment she had pulled him from the water all those years ago, his tiny body trembling in her arms, the weight of his life suddenly resting in her hands. It struck her then how unusual it was for a wild creature to remember a human so deeply, and for a human to carry a wild creature so close in her heart for so long. And yet, it had happened. That winter, there were no more visits, and Margaret didn't expect any. But when the snow began to melt in early spring, and the wind carried the scent of pine and thawing earth, she found herself standing at her porch rail once more, scanning the edge of the forest. Because love, she realized, wasn't about holding on, it was about making room for someone to return whenever they were ready. Spring unfolded gently that year. Wildflowers pushed through the soft soil, painting the meadows with blues, yellows, and whites. The river ran fuller and faster, carrying with it the sounds of life returning. Margaret's days passed quietly, her steps slower now, but her mind sharp and watchful. It was on one of those clear mornings, when the air still held the coolness of dawn, that she heard it, a low, familiar huff. Her heart paused mid-beat. Slowly, she turned toward the porch steps, her eyes scanning the yard. There he was. Taller now, heavier through the shoulders, his fur glinting with the sheen of winter's end. He stood at the edge of the clearing, not moving closer yet, as if to give her time to believe her eyes. Margaret felt an old warmth spread through her chest. "You remembered," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her words the way a person would. Still, something in his deep, steady gaze told her he understood. He approached with the same careful grace he always had, each step deliberate. When he reached the bottom of the porch steps, he lifted his head slightly, breathing her in. Margaret reached out her weathered hand, resting it gently against the air between them. Neither moved for a long moment. The wind stirred the grass. A bird called from somewhere near the river. The world seemed to pause, holding space for their reunion. Finally, he gave a soft chuff, almost like a sigh, and lowered himself to the ground, sitting in the dappled sunlight. Margaret eased herself into the rocking chair, her tea forgotten on the small table beside her. They stayed like that for hours, not needing touch or speech. Just presence. Two lives that had once crossed by accident, now bound by something much deeper, an unspoken promise that neither would forget the other. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, he rose, stretched, and looked at her one last time. Margaret smiled, her eyes bright. "Go on now," she said softly. "I'll be here." And then he turned, walking back toward the trees. The forest seemed to close around him, the shadows swallowing his form until he was gone. But the echo of his visit remained, in her porch boards, in the grass where he'd sat, and in the quiet rhythm of her heart. That night, Margaret slept with her window open, the scent of pine drifting in. Somewhere out there, in the vast and wild dark, she knew he was moving under the stars. And she knew, without doubt, that when the time was right, he would return again.